Our strategy, as simple as it sounds and as like cliche as it is to focus on us. The 95% of the game is our game plan, and the 5% is micro adjustments based on what the other team wants to do. So riding our superpowers out tonight is going to be important for us.
So much talented youth combined with the veteran leadership. They've recoalesced the talent, and this is exactly how the Spiders won back-to-back championships in the mid-2010s. Just like this.
Gordon keeps it alive and then fires to the end zone, and it's caught! Are you kidding me? What a play!
Putting on the Jets and hitting the turf.
Oh, he got there!
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner, and I'm joined by Evan Lepler, recapping the news from around the league, as well as looking forward to the action ahead. We're in between weeks 2 and 3, Evan, and boy, this season certainly is heating up quickly. We've got Oakland at 3-0 out in the West, looking like they're the fastest starting team in the 2025 season so far. You've got 2-0 Philly, leading the East Division standings. 2 impressive wins against DC and Toronto so far this season. Atlanta through a game and a little bit more than a quarter. We'll get to the news around the postponement of last week's game of the week later in this episode. But Atlanta, they've been starting off hot as well. They've been showcasing the best offensive play in the association so far. There's lots more intriguing matchups coming up. Where does your mind kind of sit at this juncture right now? We're still awaiting on the debuts of some pretty important teams, especially in the Central Division, with Minnesota still waiting to make, their 2025 debut. That'll be this Saturday. And then Chicago, the Union, they'll be debuting a week later. What do you kind of make of this 2025 UFA landscape so far?
Yeah, you didn't even mention the Detroit Mechanix standalone Sunday afternoon game against Pittsburgh. Get ready, Detroit fans. The biggest story in my mind's got to be the Hotbirds, right? Like the Philadelphia Phoenix, who you and I viewed as an afterthought coming into the season. They've won at DC. They beat Toronto at home, and they've looked pretty good doing it. Like Sam Grossberg was a revelation this past week, 19-year-old kid, just finished up his freshman year at Georgia Tech. Like, he has kind of been the rising guy in the Philly scene since he was like 13, 14, 15 years old. And, Brandon Pastor quoted the Winklevoss twins saying, like, and there's 2 of them, because Adam Grossberg is going to make his season debut this weekend for the first time in the UFA. The Grossberg brothers are going to play together up in Toronto. Excited about that. Yeah, I just think it's amazing, Adam, that in the preseason we're like, all right, the East has 4 teams, New York, DC, Boston, and maybe Toronto, that could potentially make it all the way to championship weekend and win the whole thing. And like, how is this going to get sorted out? And, Montreal, Philly, they're trying hard, but they're just overmatched. They can't compete with this top 4. And now here we are. And as I've said in writing and intimated on the pod, like, I am becoming a believer in this Philly team as a capable contender in any game they play, which, I might eat my words if they lose 25-10 up in Toronto this weekend. But I just see what they're doing offensively and know kind of the veteran infrastructure that they've got and the young players that they're adding. And you called Scott Heyman like the early season MVP in your power rankings. I can't argue with you there. I just think it's a really exciting, fascinating story, because never before in the history of the league have we had like the Kurt Warner 1999 St. Louis Rams, where like a team that you never thought could be even in the playoffs was then like in the mix to be one of the better teams in the league and potentially win the Super Bowl. And I'm not picking Philly to win the championship. That would be hyperbolic, but they look very, very competitive. And, I don't think they're going to play anybody who's that much better than DC or Toronto. Now, I could be proven wrong because they have New York and Boston and Carolina and Pittsburgh. So they got a tough schedule. Like, coming into the season, we said Atlanta had the toughest schedule in the league. Philly was right there with them. And we just thought, all right, poor Phoenix, this means like even more sincerely, they're not going to have a chance. But now I think they have a chance. And, a week ago, I was kind of more enthusiastic about them than you were after the win against DC. Where are you on Philadelphia as they head into week 3?
I've got to say I'm equally impressed as you are. I just, the bona fides are still kind of waiting to be proven for me yet. I think that the wind was such a variable in that season opening win at DC where there was, nearly 60 combined turnovers between the two teams that I just want to, I want to just keep a little bit of a foot on the decelerator here before going over the moon and saying that they're going to be a championship contender. But the things I really like about this team, let's get to those first. Like you say, kind of the cornerstone pieces. I mentioned it in my rankings. Sean Mott is playing the best ultimate hit of his career. He's such a good distributor and so calm, cool, and collected as kind of the QB1 of that offense, just pivoting and distributing wherever they need the disc to go. And I think his ability to command that offensive system just provides such a stability for a Phoenix O-line that has been searching for that for the better part of their franchise's existence. Like when we talk about inconsistencies on offense, that Philly might lead the entire association over the last 10 years. It's felt like they've had a new lineup, a new setup every, 2 seasons, except for the fact that Sean Mott is there just throwing heaters all over the field. And now that he has some real pieces that work with and complement him, and Sam Grossberg and Scott Heyman, you can see that the ceiling of this Philly team just goes up a level. So you talk about like what's there and what to like. Sean Mott, like I mentioned in the rankings too, Scott Heyman is playing out of his mind so far this year. You just talk about a beast in one-on-one scenarios. He just seems to want to win every disc, every throw, every possession right now. Having that kind of guy leading your charge clearly produces successful results. Grossberg having one of the best rookie debuts we've probably ever seen, I think is a really telling future sign for this Phoenix team. Where I start to question it is just how sustainable is this? We've seen them come close a number of times against DC. That is a very familiar foe that honestly has been a coin flip result for several seasons in a row now. And Philly just didn't get like a statistical break to go there directly.
It was like it came up tails 10 times in a row, not in their favor.
Exactly. And so to say that like that proves something about this Philly team that wasn't already there, I want to depress that just a little bit because again, they went to overtime last season. James Pollard put up 800 odd yards and 10 total scores against DC, and they just happened to falter at the very end of the game. And this time, they proved themselves. It's a much more convincing win against the Toronto team this past weekend. But again, that's a rush team that lacks, I think, the systemic advantages that this coaching staff that got brought in over the offseason, headlined by David Brandolph in Philly, that's, I think, really turned this team around. You see the differences in the kind of structuring of their lineups and the sort of roles that the Phoenix players are immediately stepping into versus on the opposite side of the disc, this Toronto team that has all the talent in the world, but they're kind of just playing in silos. It's very much individual plays here and there, but no real cohesion of the unit. And I just think that difference between team and individual, between Philly and Toronto respectively, is going to be the deciding factor on who is in the playoff hunt after this week 3 matchup and who might be a little bit more on the rocks.
How cool is it to see how Nate Little has grown up since he joined the league in 2021 as a 21-year-old, and now he's 25, and like maybe he was like a young man, a boy when he joined the league. He's a man now, taking big matchups, getting D's on some of the better cutters in the league. Like, he's had an unbelievable start to the season, and it's just interesting to see other guys that have been on the team for a while but have been overshadowed by either teammates or other teams in the division just stepping up. Like, Mike Campanella has been a long time guy who's played really well. Brandon Pastor has scored 8 goals in 2 games, was really good in a fourth quarter when the Phoenix needed to be good offensively in the fourth quarter because, it felt like the Rush momentum was moving in their favor after that layout grab tied the game at 11-all from Tom's Appletines, and yet Philly found a way late, and you could make the case, as you kind of did, like, yeah, the Rush, second day of a back-to-back, their 8th quarter in like 20, 21 hours. It's a tough ask for Toronto, and I don't think 0-2 Rush is panic time. I don't even think 0-3 Rush would be panic time, but the sense of urgency would go up a lot. I do think it's notable, Adam.
If they went to 0-3, I don't think we could call it a reboot anymore. For a team that's coming off of a 1-win season, I think we'd have to start reevaluating that little marketing campaign at that point. I just wanted to touch for a second on what you were bringing up about Philly's defense. Nate Little absolutely has emerged as kind of a top tier defender, I think, in the East Division, especially as a big and his ability to control aerial space in the end zone in particular. He had that big end zone interception late in the game against DC. He came in against Toronto and had a terrific layout block there. But this whole Philly D-line, too, has just been coming on. I mean, Paul Owens is still there, one of the best handler defenders in the division, if not the league as a whole. He's been great on the counterattack. Talk about Eric Whitmer, Andres Rodriguez. These are guys that have been there a couple of seasons, and you just see again that chemistry, that knowledge on the defensive side of the ball that really starts to pay off with a couple of years of investment. And I think that, again, this Philly coaching staff has really seized the moment, and you touched on it in your toss this past weekend. They're conditioned better than they ever have been. They're playing to the moment this year. There's a fine tuning going on right now in Philly that I think most teams should be paying attention to because they're just kind of nailing all their marks.
Yeah, it's a really fun storyline, and the clock could strike midnight over the course of the next few weeks because
that's the thing, right?
They could lose to Toronto, and then their next 2 games are at home, but against New York and Carolina. And the Empire and Flyers have their own issues that we can discuss. That they have interesting matchups this weekend, both of them Friday and Saturday, respectively. Like, the league just in a really fascinating spot right now because there's going to be real meaningful matchups every single week, and with only 12 games, like these games in week 2 and week 3 are going to determine who's in it at the end and who's wishing they had done things a little bit differently early in the season. Like New York is the first game of the upcoming weekend. They're home from Montreal. You think, all right, the Empire against Montreal, New York's big favorite. Calvin Brown making his debut. I feel like New York had like a Calvin Brown-sized hole in their O-line when I saw them out in Oakland a few Thursdays ago. And I'm just really interested to see how he looks, how he fits in, and can the Empire look like the team that we've been used to them being over the past half decade at home against a team that they should beat?
Yeah. I think it's a big prove-it weekend for New York, and I think that they're up to that task. I think that they quietly licked their wounds after that loss in Oakland on opening night, and now they have real motivation again. I think we've been talking about it throughout the history of this podcast and extending back into last year that this New York team has been recombobulating itself kind of on the go for the past 16 months, and I feel like they're finally getting back to, okay, this is what works for us. This is the lineup that we want to play with. And here are the star pieces that we're going to kind of rally around. And I would be fearful if I was the rest of the East Division right now. I almost think in the rear view, it might have done everyone else good for New York just to have swept that West Coast showcase and not come back with this single loss that's just going to be a thorn in their paw the rest of the season that they're going to be taking out on other teams. It feels like how they were treating teams towards the end of last season before Boston upended them, where after that Atlanta loss and after a loss to DC, they just started to dispatch Minnesota and Salt Lake. But I anticipate a really strong debut for Calvin Brown. I'm interested to see what that means for Jack Williams. Coming into the season, you had some reporting that he was going to be anchored a little bit more around the disc, a little bit less of a receiver. I don't necessarily hope that that's entirely the case going forward. I hope that with Brown's presence, we'll see a little bit more of, Jack getting loose as a receiver downfield. I think that in tandem,
Absolutely.
in tandem with Max Shepard, that just is kind of the highest potential for this New York offense in my mind. And so interested to see again, how Brown's debut sort of affects the rest of this New York O-line that, has had a lot of stagnancy over the last, 15 or so games.
Yeah, I think adding Calvin in, if he's in form, will allow Jack to move downfield a little bit more and be an initiator and a continuation on Shepard's cuts, and let Yacht be more of a downfield striker than, a guy who's coming under and distributing. Plus, like, Calvin's a gunslinger, and he's got some beautiful, beautiful throws, his angles, his release points. Like, I just think the New York offense clearly was off and missing something, and like just Calvin Brown in his finest form, I feel like solves a lot of those problems and fits in well. And the Empire have Montreal at home this Friday. Next Friday, they are in Boston for the rematch of the playoff game that ended their dynasty, that you might say, because they had won the previous 2 championships and they were eliminated from the playoffs last year in Boston. So another, we don't need to talk about any New York-Boston battle going on in the other sports. You know how I like to focus on just Frisbee on this podcast.
Totally, Evan. Yeah, we definitely should not mention any other sports Boston teams in an 0-2 hole per se. Again,
stay tunnel vision with what we got right here.
A team from the Big Apple per se. Yeah.
Yeah, per se. Exactly. I'm really excited for the Frisbee version of Boston, New York, because there's just so many wrinkles and angles to that matchup, from the Jeff Babbitt side to, Toba DeCrana joining Glory, and Calvin Stoughton is probably not a name that we've spent enough time harping on in the preseason, but like he looked really good in Boston's opener, and he's just another like the downfield quartet of Babbitt, DeCrana, Stoughton, and Orion Cable, just from like size and skill and speed and smart. Like, does another team have a downfield foursome that instills as much fear as that group? I mean, it's an interesting conversation. I don't know the answer, but I just think like that group for Boston seems pretty darn special. And, Boston has Montreal this weekend on the Royale, second day of a back-to-back. But that's what New York's getting ready for. And, if New York has 2 losses by the end of week 4, like alarm bells start to ring a little bit for the Empire, I think.
Well, let's not get too far ahead and start casting all the way out into week 4. Let's resettle a bit onto week 3, and maybe on Friday night, the Friday night Frisbee matchup, the first one that you won't be calling so far this season. You'll be based out of Carolina heading into week 3, but we've got a terrific rematch in the West Division after last week's 1-goal finish between Oakland and Seattle. We have yet to talk about it here on this podcast, so I feel like we should settle in for a minute on this matchup.
Yeah.
Spiders.
What a game that was. What a game that was last week up in Seattle.
Yeah. Spiders come out with the 22-21 win over the reigning West Division champions, the Cascades. Oakland, as I said at the top of this episode, they improved to 3-0, sit atop the West Division standing. Cascades, meanwhile, start their season 0-1. Now they get a 1-week turnaround, not even 6 days. And they're playing on Friday night on the UFA YouTube channel. Evan, what are you most anticipating about this matchup? These teams have now split each of their past 2 meetings. It really feels like this is a deepening rivalry that is starting to really crack into the league's truly elite. And I'm just really excited for the amount of young playmaking talent that is going to be on display. You talk about Walker Frankenberg and Zeppelin Ronning also deserving to be in that MVP conversation. They're going to be in prime time. There's a lot of fireworks, I feel like, getting ready to set off between the Cascades and Spiders down by the bay.
And there's definitely, a little potential symmetry, because you look early season last year, May 3rd, Seattle wins 22-21 at Oakland. 8 days later, Oakland wins 22-21 in Seattle. And then, of course, they met in the playoffs. Seattle got it done at home. My biggest takeaway for this, thoughts about this game are just how brilliant Oakland's offense was through the first three quarters this past Saturday in Seattle. Like, they were crisp, they were confident, they were steady, they were just almost flawless. They were like flawless at the half, had one or two hiccups in the third, and then kind of the wheels fell off in the fourth. And like the question, as I wrote in the toss, is did Seattle figure something out, either schematically or just, getting their legs under them because it was their first game of the season, whereas Oakland had, a really tough test the week before? Or did the Spiders just kind of take it easy in the fourth and let their foot off the gas? And, it's hard to maintain your focus through four quarters in the UFA. That's why, teams turn the disc over and, it's hard to go through a game unbroken. It doesn't happen very often at all. I feel like the Spiders were kind of the best version of themselves through much of those first three quarters. And I also felt like Seattle was certainly different without Spencer Lofink in the backfield. He's dealing with an injury. They're hopeful to get him back at some point, but I don't expect him to play this weekend. Lucas Ambrose had an early block, but then wasn't a huge factor the rest of the game. And yeah, my main thoughts, Adam, to get to your point finally, is just that this Oakland team has the look to me. Like, they've got different guys stepping up. They've got a bunch of stars on offense and a bunch of role players on offense too. Like, they just have the look of a really complete team. And I lean towards thinking Oakland should be the team that they were the first three quarters up in Seattle. But I also wouldn't be stunned if the Cascades turn it around just like they did last year in this rivalry. As you said, it is a really interesting West Division rivalry right now.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you about your assessment of Oakland's offense through the first three quarters. Leo Gordon and Adam Reese. Is there a better duo that any team has added so far this season than those two? I know they're both technically rookies, but they're more veterans and the more traditional players to know in the ultimate scene right now. And gosh, those guys are just playing at such a high level. To your point, the two games that they started the season against New York and then against Seattle, those were two of the top defenses from last year. They feature some of the best individual defenders in the league: Antoine Davis, John Randolph on New York. JR wasn't active in that game, I believe. But, in Seattle, we have the reigning defensive player of the year, Lucas Ambrose. Reese and Walker Frankenberg, they were just cutting through any sort of coverages that were thrown at them. And Gordon just seems to have a perfect understanding of how to increase the tempo and really feed those targets so that they're just perpetually beating out defensive arrangements. It feels unfair at times. There were times where Seattle in those first three quarters would try to gain any momentum and Oakland would just respond with a quick strike score in under 30 seconds or so. It was just, and from anywhere on the field, they would sometimes blitz you up with sort of a small ball possession where Frankenberg is just shifting between receiver and thrower at whim. And then at other times, it's just boosting it deep, just looking for Reese breaking away from his defender and finding an easy huck score in deep space. The versatility and the ceiling of this team, I think, has shown to be something like Atlanta on the offensive side of the disc. Where I start to get worried is just some of the larger metrics. They still haven't cracked an 80% conversion rate inside the red zone in their first three games. That's a little bit of a red flag for me if they really want to be, a quote unquote top 5 team, as I currently have them in my power rankings. And also, again, they did almost fumble away the ball there on the road against Seattle in the fourth quarter.
My goodness. Yeah.
It was all Oakland through the first three quarters. They were up 5 and then they just could not maintain. And I'll tell you what, we've seen that in the past from Oakland. This is a franchise that has in the past slipped away, from victories, from playoff chances when they had sort of an edge, a leverage, or an advantage. And to see them do that again, it sets off my spidey senses a bit, and it says, okay, this was, Seattle playing their first game. What happens when they take on an opponent with their feet underneath of them a little bit more? So I am impressed through the ceiling with the Spiders so far. Similar to Philly, I need to see a little bit more of it before I vault them into that true contender status, I feel like. Although Oakland, I feel like right now is a little bit closer to that high-end ceiling.
Yeah. Shout out to the Cascades for the way they battled back in that fourth quarter. And I don't know, like, what your mindset was. Like, with 37 seconds left, after what you had just seen the previous 11 minutes and 23 seconds with Oakland's offense really struggling, like, did you expect them to march down calmly and convert and win the game in that moment? Because I did not. At that point, I really expected chaos to continue, either the Cascades to get a chance to win it at the buzzer or for the game to go to overtime. But to Oakland's credit, like, that was one of the best end of game offensive sequences I can remember, in terms of never really feeling that pressure. There were a couple throws that, like, where the stall count got to 4 or 5 and they had some nice vision on resets. But for the most part, like, 11 throws, just cool, calm, collected down the field, have the disc on the goal line with 5 seconds left, and basically a walk-in score that didn't give Seattle any time. But again, before it happened, I would have said, no, Seattle's going to get a stop here. What did you think watching it live?
I mean, that was what really cemented them as a top 5 team so far this season, right? Their ability to take the most important possession of their season, walk it all the way down the field against a defense that had rhythm throughout that quarter, and then just, to your point, basically do a handoff for the game winner and leave scant amount of time for the Cascades to respond with any kind of buzzer beater attempt on the other end of the field. I mean, it's the thing that reverses some of the trend for the Spider squad, where you say, okay, we haven't really seen them do that kind of clutch closeout before. We haven't seen them go on the road and handle a very good opponent in that sort of fashion. And I think it speaks all the world to Kara Miriam and the new coaching staff, as well as where the Spiders are at right now. You just talk about where the leadership has brought this team to, and again, the added talent. And yeah, like you were saying, they've got that look. They've got that look. And so now, they've got to kind of really take care of, I think, the harder task, which is beating a good team twice,
and potentially a third time, because Oakland's next 2 games are home against Seattle this Friday, and then Saturday, May 24th. That's the next game after that. So that's a weird dynamic for the Spiders. Like, yes, it's a team that you just beat, but it's also a team that can beat you, and you give a team that many shots at you, they're probably going to get you one of those days, right?
Well, and I think that makes this Friday's matchup kind of the most important of the 3, because it's sort of like almost the best of 3 series. If Oakland goes up 2-0, that effectively gives them the season the season series, and then they hold a potential playoff tiebreaker later in the season. And as we've been talking throughout the past several episodes, each of these divisions is going to go 3+ teams deep. You can't afford to go in a hole right now. I know you were saying earlier that Toronto, could maybe afford an 0-3 hole. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think specifically Seattle has to avoid an 0-2 hole against Oakland, of all teams. I think Oakland is the team that could kind of claim Seattle's throne in this West Division most easily after last season.
Adam, what's the better story? Oakland being 4-0 and like looking like a true championship contender, or like Seattle getting like a 1 or 2 goal win, returning the favor? It's 1-1 through 2. The third game's coming up. The West Division's still really muddy. What's a better story that you'd rather cover?
I kind of, I don't always like to think about it that way. I think what I would most like to see is just Zeppelin Rane go berserk again for 10 goals. And then, maybe Seattle takes one back, and then I have to eat my words. And actually the third game of the 3 is the most important. And that'll be a true rubber match for a potential playoff spot in the West Division between 2 hard charging squads. And again, like, I always kind of like in sports, the return volley. So Oakland has started really hot. it would be kind of amazing to watch the Cascades stop them short, maybe, return the favor in their home venue and just really ignite this candle in the West.
I was thinking in the aftermath of Zeppelin's 10-goal game, just like how much fun it would be to have like a statistical chase like the Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa home run chase in 1998, which is really dating myself now. But like, look, if he could score 10 goals in every game, that would set a record, right? Even in a 12-game season, because the single season record belongs to Misha Freistatter with the Cannons in 2016. He had 95 goals in a 14-game season. And like coming into this year, that kind of felt pretty insurmountable, right? Like, I mean, last year,
and I think especially with defensive.
Alec Wilson-Holiday was 35 goals shy of that mark last year. Jeff Babbitt led the league, including the playoffs, with exactly 60 goals the year before. No one had more than 60 goals. The only person to score more than 60 goals in a season, including the playoffs, since the pandemic was Ben Yot in 2021 when he had 63. So, like, that just feels so unreachable, 95 goals in a year. But, like, if Raunig could get 8, 9, 10 goals this weekend, then, he puts another couple games together. And, like, look, Seattle's goal, no pun intended, is not to get Raunig the goals record.
Yeah, I'm not as interested in the raw total so much as, did you see how many of those goals were meaningful for Raunig last weekend? I mean, we talk about this Cascades rally in the fourth quarter. They were just feeding the big dog downfield. I mean, they almost rode him straight across the finish line to a huge come-from-behind win in their home opener. And I think what is so impressive to me about his evolution is that he really senses the moment. He's really one of those players who I think reaches a different level when his team needs a score, and it's really vaulted him into a truly elite kind of player. I mean, I know he didn't get all UFA nods last year, but man, it makes me almost regret it after his first game in 2025.
Yeah, he got off to a great start, and the Cascades are still a super interesting team. And look, this game that's happening at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific is not the only interesting Friday game that's going on the West Coast, because the San Diego Growlers are hosting the Atlanta Hustle, the 2-0 Growlers, I should add, after they took care of business against LA. It's hard to know exactly how much we learned from that, other than the fact, like, they've got a bunch of new guys that are adding to their potential. From Khalif El-Salam to Daniel Brunker to Marcel Osborne. Like, they kind of bring last year's band back together and supplement it with guys who have solid UFA experience and have won in other places. And I'm really excited for this game. Like, traveling cross country to play if you're the Hustle is not going to be easy. And San Diego's going to come out ready. Like, I think you got to look at the Hustle as the favorite, but what a story it would be if San Diego could get this win, show that they could be competitive in the new South Division. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how competitive you think San Diego can be with Atlanta's offense, which, as you rightly said at the top, is just playing at a different level right now than really we've ever seen in the league.
Yeah, I think you're right to address the Atlanta offense versus the San Diego defense as kind of the central tension in this matchup. But the other angle I want to bring up is, how about the coaching matchup between Tuba Benson-Jaja and Kevin Stewart and Kayla Helton? I mean, that's where my mind really goes. And what kind of, in the lab chemistry experiments, sort of beakers and boiling objects, plans do these two amazing staffs have for each other? Like, I just feel like there's going to be some really interesting wrinkles as far as like who matches up where. And I do think that with San Diego's additions, it's allowed them a little bit more lineup flexibility. And I think that will come in particularly handy against this Atlanta offensive lineup, and particularly against Brett Halsmeyer. We've just seen the way in which he's such a wrecking ball against opposing defenses. I think that San Diego has some height and some depth in defenders. I'm thinking about like Max Gibson and some others who might be able to address Halsmeyer downfield. Now, it's more of a limiting than taking Halsmeyer away from doing what he likes to do. But I do think that the Growlers have the kind of physicality and game planning that could put a little bit of a canopy over this Atlanta offense that is just, again, clicking on all cylinders and just seems to be able to get what it wants.
Yeah, thinking about the potential Gibson-Holzmeier matchup, I mean, that's a heavyweight bout. Gibson,
Oh, yeah.
6'5", playing 12 deep points this past Sunday, finished with 2 goals, 1 assist, and 2 blocks. That's a heck of a lot of production, 12 deep points. Now, obviously, the challenge gets bigger, but yeah, I could definitely picture him chasing Holzmeier around and maybe even winning a jump ball against him at some point. This is a really interesting San Diego team. Like the coaching points that you brought up are really good. They've been together as a staff for a long time. They've got a bunch of veterans.
Can I ask you a question? We talked about this off air a little bit ago. I wanted to bring up the idea of this offensive trio that San Diego has of KJ Koo, Travis Dunn, and Khalif El-Salam. How good do you think that they are? And do you think that they can approach, the level that Holzmeier, Hayden Austin-Knabb, and Austin Taylor are kind of orchestrating for Atlanta?
I think they've got a ways to go from a chemistry standpoint to match that Atlanta trio, if you want to call them a trio. Because, like, when you mentioned Tuba versus Kevin Stewart and Kayla, I'm like, Austin Taylor feels like a coach on the field. Just the decision making that he brings to the table and the way he orchestrates things and just has kind of, that offense on a string. No one's doing it better right now than he is. But no, I think we under-discuss KJ Koo. I think he is an incredibly talented player, and having him bought in and committed, like he's never played more than 8 UFA games in a season. He played just 3 games last year, but in the 2 games last week, he was 32 for 32, 2 goals, 1 assist, 3 blocks, mostly playing offense. But he is a foundational piece you can build around. And yeah, it was, Khalif had an interesting weekend too, played 16-0 points, 24 deep points. So it feels like, they'll probably keep doing that and have him impact the game in a variety of different ways, which I think is probably the right choice. It's hard for me to I was really excited to watch the start of that game last Saturday. Yeah, last Saturday. And he literally drops the opening underpass and LA goes in and scores. And I'm like, yikes. And then I shift my attention to, Atlanta, Carolina or DC, Toronto or whatever it was. And then all of a sudden San Diego's in control of the game. So I don't feel like I got, the full understanding of who this Growlers team is. I think I'll get a much better sense of them, particularly with the caliber of opponent and just locking in on them a little bit more this weekend. But yeah, I think that's a really big game. And, the South Division right now, you got Austin at 2-0, you got San Diego at 2-0. Carolina technically doesn't have a result yet, but they could very well be 0-1 heading to Atlanta next week with 2 results up for grabs because they've got a DC team that's hungry and desperate and talented in the game of the week this Saturday. I'll be calling that one in Durham. And then, as you mentioned, the resumption of the suspended game from last week on May 17th.
Let's clean it up just a little bit. I wanted to also touch on one more point about San Diego before we shift to the game of the week matchup. So 3 things really. San Diego X Factor, the news on the postponement of the week 2 Carolina at Atlanta game, and then we'll move into DC at Carolina for game of the week, just to kind of lay it all out there. First point,
I like it.
I wanted to talk about Daniel Brunker for a second. A new piece on San Diego who just popped on film after their 2 games against their SoCal rivals from LA. he's been kind of a secret sauce of success in this West Division for a few different playoff contenders at this point. Talking about 2022 Colorado, when he slotted in alongside Jonathan Nethercutt, Quinn Finer, Alex Atkins, Jay Fruit on that offense and just made it hum. Top 5 unit that year. Talking about the first season with Pavel Giannis on the LA Aviators, Brunker was a big part when active in kind of activating that offense's true potential. And again, in his debut with the Growlers this past weekend, it just looks like he's got this feel, this rhythm, and this tool bag as kind of a tweener between a thrower and receiver upfield where he's going to win a lot of matchups. And if teams aren't careful, he's going to be hard to contain and really take this Growlers team that, again, has kind of had stagnancy on offense, an over-reliance on Travis Dunn the past several seasons. It's going to take this Growlers O-line to a different level. And I just think Atlanta, watching how they address Brunker this weekend is going to be really crucial for that Atlanta at San Diego matchup. And then
Yeah. Says a lot about how quickly he looked really comfortable with San Diego, too.
Well, he's done that. Like, that's how he played at Colorado and LA, too. It was like
Right.
game one, boom. But
No doubt.
we should touch on the news of last weekend's postponement. Evan and I, too, have been waiting a little bit on the confirmation of the full details on this, so we apologize on behalf of both ourselves and the league for not the clearest communication on these items. But in week 2, Carolina at Atlanta, the game of the week, it was suspended due to weather, and because there was over 2 hours of game suspension, it was officially postponed. The new makeup date is announced for May 17th, and the game will be resumed from the point at which it stopped, which was Atlanta leading Carolina 8-7 with 4:35 left in the second quarter. So, once again, week 2's postponement will be made up in week 4. That game, I think, is still labeled as game of the week. We'll have to clear that little bit of detail up. But, kind of just having to, I think, set aside our thoughts from what we saw so far. Maybe we can kind of build it into what we talk about with Carolina in this Saturday's upcoming game of the week matchup against DC. One of the best, I think, interdivisional rivalries we've had in the league over the past several seasons. What did you like about the Flyers in their very brief introduction to this 2025 season?
Yeah, more than I expected, to be honest with you, with the team that they brought. But what did I like?
You were dogging them. I just gotta be honest. You were dogging them coming into that game, I think, a bit.
Well, I mean, if the game had continued, I still kind of stand by. I feel like Atlanta would have won by 5 goals with the way the lineups were and the conditions of the night. But, it was 8-7. It was on serve. What did I like? Rutledge Smith, and John McDonnell. Sean Wiles, a couple really nice plays on that O-line. I was talking with Flyers coach Michael Avila earlier today, and he's like, Wiles wasn't just on O because Fairfax wasn't there. Like, Wiles has earned his spot on that line and is going to be a really important downfield cutter for Carolina this year. Carolina has, as well as any team in the league, just an infrastructure of competent success in place. So year after year, you can put new pieces into the system and bring in a new coach even, and it still feels in a lot of ways like the same old Flyers, which are going to be good and competitive and exciting and make plays that make you say, wow, like they got a lot of highlight makers on their team and probably always will. So, yeah, I was reasonably impressed with what I saw from Carolina. And, Jacob Fairfax will be in the lineup this weekend, and so will Ethan Bloodworth, and so will Matt Tucker. So it's a better version of the Flyers coming up against the Breeze this weekend. It's still not the full version of the Flyers. There's no Elijah Long. There's no Seth Weaver. Missing a few other pieces that I was thinking about before. Xander Wilcox is still not going to play for Carolina, but they got a really good team, and frankly, so does DC. Like, the Breeze are bringing a very strong group down to Durham, and I was thinking about like just this rivalry through the years, Adam, and you called it one of the best interdivisional rivalries in the league. I don't know if you noted how in the promo that I voiced, I called it the best interdivisional rivalry in the league. I think the only thing that could be considered close is Carolina and New York, with just the 3 games that they played, the 2 double overtimes, and the championship game. Philly, Pittsburgh, maybe a soft third, just because they're the Pennsylvania thing. But like in terms of the consistency of how often you see each other as interdivisional rivals and the high level that is annual and perennial, this is the undisputed number 1 interdivisional rivalry. In many ways, like it feels like a division game because of the familiarity, because we've seen it before. I've been really fortunate to call most, if not all, of the DC Carolina games through the years. In fact, I think the one I missed was when I had COVID at the end of the 2021 season. And that was the game that Charlie called solo because I was watching it from a DC hotel room feeling terrible. But then 2 weeks later, they rematched and Carolina, had their run to the championship. So, yeah, Carolina, DC, this is very cliche for someone that lives in North Carolina, but Jay Billis likes to say, Carolina Duke, it always delivers. I feel the same way about the Breeze and the Flyers in the UFA.
I absolutely agree with your point about it being the best interdivisional rivalry. I want to introduce one other one that you didn't mention, and that's Atlanta, New York, which has had some terrific results throughout the last couple of years, and I think has really elevated to a different level given when those contests have occurred. But I completely agree with you on DC Carolina. I would love to see them in the playoffs again. We haven't gotten that since 2021 when Carolina bettered DC in the nation's capital to advance to championship weekend and then go on to win the Flyers' first and only UFA championship. But getting back to this matchup, what do you kind of expect from DC? I feel like they've had 2 very differing results in their first 2 games. Obviously, again, wind really affected and several missing starters, their first results of the season. But this past weekend looked a lot more like the DC team that we're used to. Jacques Nissen was in absolute control on the DC offense, and with Tyler Monroe and Christian Boxley making their 2025 debuts, everything was just clicking in that kind of small ball flurry that DC loves to operate with against any opponent in kind of any scenario. Do you think that there's anything the Flyers can do in this matchup to slow that down? DC has gotten the better of them in each of the past 2 meetings, and it feels like there's just a little bit of a systemic advantage for this Breeze franchise against the Flyers right
now. I would agree with that statement in part, but I do think that the Breeze haven't completely looked like themselves through the first 2 weeks of the season. Now, they certainly made strides from week 1 to week 2, and I got their numbers as a team pulled up right in front of me. Like they chopped their turnovers in half. The Wind not being as ferocious this past week against Toronto, certainly a part of that. They upped their red zone conversion rate from 65% to 85%. Their D-line conversion rate was 27% to 50%. Like their completion percent, 96% compared to 92 the week before. So they're moving in the right direction. I feel like they are, very capable of being the best team in the league that I thought they were going to be coming into the season. But I also think that they were kind of scary close to blowing that game to Toronto. And like the Rush arguably had more firepower than DC did with Arvids and Toms and Marty Gallant and Mike McKenzie and Phil Turner and just all those dudes that Toronto brought to the table.
Can I ask you a question about DC? Do you think that their offense, as appealing as it is, both I think in terms of its discipline and its ability to use several starters on the field kind of in unity, do you think that its strengths are currently being outweighed by its inability just to score at will more often? Because to your point that you were just making, it was like watching DC do the most fantastic weave drive with 50 plus passes on one possession, and then Toronto would come out and just bomb it to Karkland's deep in like 3 throws, and they both count as the same amount of points. And it's just at a certain level, is there not something that DC needs to do to create more separation between them and other good teams? Like, it just feels like there's now been several results against good playoff level competition where the Breeze can't separate in a real way. Like, they have this obviously talented and terrific O-line, but it can't kind of score quickly enough to build on a lead.
Yeah, no, I'm wary of drawing any like huge conclusions, but I think those observations are really astute because I mean the Breeze are not among the poorest hucking teams in the league right now. They are dead last, 33.3% huck completion rate through their first 2 games. And it's pretty staggering. And you think about how, like, yeah, they don't have a lot of size. And, it works both ways, right? Like, Carolina's going to have a bunch of big, feisty defenders from Drew Swanson to John Wellers to Matt Tucker, like guys that can go up and make plays in the air. And, a question I have going into this week is how are those guys going to do chasing around, DC's type of cutter that, the Cole Jureks and Tyler Monroe and Christian Boxley, a little bit more speed than size oriented. I'm curious how that's going to go. Yeah, I think DC, I think a couple things. The Breeze have been running this system for a long time. And I think, number one, teams are getting a little more familiar and comfortable playing against it. Number two, the guy that kind of crafted the system and tweaked the system is no longer the quarterback of the system. And that's Johnny Malks. And I think going into the season, one of the reasons I was so high on the Breeze was I'm like, oh, they still got Jacques Nissen and Andrew Roy and Thomas Edmonds and Gus Norbaum. Like, they're going to be fine. Like, as good as Johnny is, they had a luxury of riches, and all those guys can do what Johnny did in various ways. And I've had a couple different people say to me, like, the energy that Johnny brings when he's standing on the line, and as like just the type of emergency punch glass that can get you out of trouble guy to having tricky situations on the field. Like, as a thrower and as a cutter, Johnny kind of was that guy with the vision to find spaces both as a thrower and a cutter. So I do think perhaps maybe more than I recognized in the preseason, that transition could be a little bit of a factor. And I do think DC will continue to improve and be in the mix, but like, they also could be 1-2 coming out of this game because, as we've talked about, the Flyers are really good. Like, there are just more losses given to good teams than we're used to early in the season, I think, this year, because there are more good teams. And like, who does DC play after this game against Carolina? They got Boston, and then they go to Toronto. So like, there are lots of opportunities for L's on the schedule. And that's what makes every week interesting. And that's what makes these games like the Breeze and Flyers on Saturday so important for both of the teams. How would you answer that question about the Breeze offense? Because I've been rambling for a bit. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you've seen from DC and what you expect to see this weekend.
No, I think your observations about Johnny Malks are spot on. He just had that absolute sense for when to stretch the field vertically. He was, to your point, the orchestrator and operator of that whole system. It's kind of like trying to run the triangle offense without Jordan a little bit. I mean, obviously stretching some comparisons here, but just to the point of when you don't have the person that the system is sort of designed for. Sure, there's various other good and talented players who can fulfill it, but that feel, right? That kind of intangible element of like, okay, we're going to be small and now all of a sudden we're going to take that shot downfield. That was Malks' specialty, and while he wasn't necessarily the highest volume hucker in the league the past couple of years, his feel again for when to stretch something out for the DC offense was impeccable. And I just think, to your point, they don't quite have that yet. You can see there's just this ability to make the flurry of movement that outpaces basically any defensive coverage imaginable that the DC offense has been predicated on for several years, but it doesn't then break out of it ever. It doesn't really do anything other than kind of whirling dervish its way up the field and effectively do, various breakthrows to get handoffs and make, possessions very manageable. I think that, there is sometimes a limit, and I think you just saw that especially exposed against the Toronto team that just started taking shots downfield to favorable one-on-one matchups and winning a lot of them. And so I think, DC has something to adjust. And just, again, to your point too, they've kind of got their backs a bit against the wall already with this loss to Philly in week 1. I mean, squeaking out another win at home against Toronto helps a little bit, but it's sort of like they're walking a plank here for the next several weeks in order to get to, I think, a comfortable position in the East Division standings.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I don't feel like Toronto, even at 0-3, would be out of it, because I feel like they, as much as any other team, are positioned to get better as the year goes along. The more those guys play together and play with the Canadian guys that mix in. Mark Lloyd still hasn't played. Simone Gasparini still hasn't played. And look, if DC loses this game, and we talked about the schedule, DC could be sitting there at 1-3. New York could lose to Boston. They could have 2 losses.
One of those things again where you move so fast and you say something like, DC 1-3. Like we all just entered the season with that in our minds or something.
The point is that there's going to be a lot of results that get mixed in there, and maybe one of the East Division teams separates themselves with 0, 1, or 2 losses, but it also could be 4 or 5 even teams that have 4 or 5 losses, and it's really tight in the 6-6, 7-5, 8-4 range at the very top of the division.
Oh yeah, no, I think it's a very valid point. I just think it's crazy that we're already extending to possible narratives of, DC 1-3, what happens when Seattle starts 0-2 and Oakland's 4-0. There's already realms of possibility that are so much closer than I anticipated at this point in the season. Again, Philly 3-0 leading the East Division, just what we all pegged coming into 2025.
Yeah, I mean, you look through DC's schedule, at Carolina this week, home for Boston, at Toronto, and then at Montreal on the second day of a back-to-back. Then their next 2 games after that are both against New York. And then they still have Boston 2 more times. And then they finish at Philly, a team they lost to. These teams in their schedules, especially in the East Division, it's just every single week. I mean, the narrative has a chance to change, but momentum can snowball on you quick, and you can, that's why I think you're not Toronto at 0-3 wouldn't be out of it, because I think that highly of their top level talent, but it's just really interesting. We're in a place where we've never been before. I've never felt this way about the league, where you look at a schedule and see that many games that a team that I consider a championship contender is capable of losing. Even Atlanta last year, you would still pencil them in against Houston and Dallas. They're probably going to win most of their games at home, even against Austin, even though they lost in the playoff. There is just, it's a different place than we've been in the past. And I think that's, as much as anything, one of the big lessons and takeaways from the first 2 weeks of the season.
Are there any other points you wanted to touch on before we kind of signed off here today? Any other lessons that you have through the first 2 weeks? Again, we haven't really had a chance to completely recap week 2. I feel like we haven't really touched on Austin starting 2-0 and looking really impressive, especially in the offensive side of the disc. Madison, they split their Texas 2-step, going 1-1, winning at Houston and then dropping their game at Austin. Is there anything else that you kind of have percolating on your brain as we head into week 3, or are you just getting set for these upcoming matchups? And again, just awaiting, to your point a second ago, just another division being toppled and our understanding just getting inverted overnight.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've hit the big picture stuff. Austin, Houston again this coming weekend. Maybe the Havoc could change the narrative, but I don't expect it. So I think it'll be the 3-0 Austin Soul hosting a Colorado Summit team on the second day of a back-to-back next weekend, which is a really juicy game that we've never seen before that I'm very, very excited about. We've got a really good week 3 coming up, not complaining at all. But week 4 is even better because you got New York, Boston, you got Colorado and Texas, you got Chicago and Minnesota. We finally get to see who the Union might be. And then you got 2 Carolina, Atlanta results. And then on Sunday of that weekend, you got Boston, DC, because Boston's home for New York on Friday and then at DC on Sunday. So, next
and
weekend,
Madison Radicals home opener that I'll get my 2025 introduction to broadcasting on. So, and that's
you're not wrong.
A game that will likely determine or be a major part of determining the 3 seed in the Central Division between Pittsburgh and Madison. So don't skip on that one either.
No, I shouldn't have. And any game at Breese Stevens Field is worth watching. And the Madison Radicals and the Pittsburgh Thunderbirds, you're absolutely right, are both playoff contenders. And that is a really good game.
Pittsburgh's never won at Breese Stevens Field. I was reminded of that this week by a member from the Pittsburgh organization. And it kind of slipped my brain a little bit, but this Thunderbirds team has some pretty good motivation coming up. I know they've got Detroit in week 3, but they've got to have their calendars circled a few times for that Madison matchup here on May 17th.
Detroit doesn't lose at home to Pittsburgh. It just doesn't happen. So that's going to be a tough one for the Thunderbirds too.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an onslaught of good matchups. And again, we've already gotten ahead ourselves. We're talking about week 4. We should stick to week 3, which is going to be starting tomorrow night on the UFA YouTube channel. But you're also going to want to switch over to Watch UFA TV and check out the San Diego Atlanta affair. There are 11 games total coming up in week 3. Evan and I will be tuning in along with you to watch all the action. And I think this week we'll be ready again for some rapid reacts because I anticipate some results here we're going to want to, go over in pretty immediate response.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun weekend. As you said, I will not be on the Friday Night Frisbee game this week. It's the one that I'm planning to skip throughout the season. Certainly have some regrets about that with the quality of the matchup that Seattle-Oakland is going to be. But I really look forward to listening to Ian Toner and Katie Killebrew, who will be on the call of that one. And then I chose the game that's a 75-minute drive away rather than a 5-hour flight. So I'll be in D.C., Carolina for that interdivisional game. And yeah, man, it's gonna be an exciting weekend, and hopefully my Celtics don't go down 0-3 on Saturday afternoon. You'll be able to hear the tone of my voice if they do on Saturday night. That's for sure.
Well, now I'm kind of hoping for that, but I'm also hoping for a really exciting weekend. We thank you all for tuning in now, but we're out. Talk soon.